Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out to the next edition of our Java. Sorry, that was this morning. Too much going on today. Guest speaker series. There we go. I'm on track here. So tonight we have Stephen Tuloweicki from SUNY Geneseo. He is an associate professor of geography, and he has recently written a book, The Atlas of Letchworth State Park. But he'll be discussing many different aspects of the park today, not just geography. So we're very happy to have him. And Stephen, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Once again, my name is Steve Tuloweicki. I'm here to talk about my multi-year project that just culminated 1 year ago. I'll be talking mainly about my Letchworth State Park Atlas, but I'll also be providing some new peeks into the park, a new insight into the park. So the title of my talk today is the Letchworth State Park Atlas, a fresh look at America's favorite state park. To provide further introduction to myself, once again, I'm an associate professor at the newly rebranded Department of Geography and Sustainability Studies at SUNY Geneseo. This project that I'll be talking about, this Letchworth State Park Atlas, this is a departure from what I typically do. This is my first book, my first atlas. My research is typically in historical forest conditions. I'm a biogeographer or forest ecologist by trade, so this was a very different project for me. It's also very appropriate to mention, a lot of my dissertation research and other research actually uses the field notes of the Holland Land Company land surveys. So that is a major data set that I use for my other research that creeps in a little bit into this Letchworth State project that I'll be talking about. So I visited this museum. I spent a lot of time looking at the Holland Land Office archives, not necessarily here, but at Fredonia and elsewhere. As I've mentioned, the basis for today's talk is the Letchworth State Park Atlas, which was published 1 year ago or so. This was published by the SUNY Press. This was nominated by Forward Reviews for the best book of the year in the nonfiction category, in the regional category, so that was exciting to get that accolade. Just a few bits of information about this atlas. It's over 130 pages of maps. A lot of the maps are in color. There's some black and white as well. There's also 35 color photographs by local photographer Keith Walters. He just opened a gallery in Geneseo. And it's on sale through all the common venues and outlets like Amazon, through the SUNY Press website, but it's also on sale here for $25 today after my talk. I would like to do four things here tonight for you. First of all, I want to provide a brief background into how this Atlas project began. I want to just give an overview of the project. That's the second bullet point up here, just to talk about what's in the Atlas. I also want to share within that section some of my favorite maps as well. I want to spend some time also reading some book excerpts. What I have decided to structure the excerpts around is the environmental and human history of the park, in keeping with the theme and mission of the Holland Land Office Museum here. And then also I do want to present some Atlas outtakes. What didn't miss the cut? You're going to learn that a lot of maps didn't make the cut due to kind of space limitations and other considerations. There are really three sources of inspiration, I would say, or three motivations for this project. First of all, I'm a person with pretty deep roots to Letchworth State Park. This is a photograph of my great-great-great-uncle, Albert. My great-great-grandfather lived in Mount Morris. I put my great-great-great-uncle up here because he was an avid photographer. He photographed Letchworth State Park in the late 1800s. So here are some of his photographs of Letchworth State Park. So Letchworth State Park's always been a curiosity of mine. These photos are a family heirloom, really. And I was always just kind of mesmerized by these photos, just to compare what you see in these photos to what you see there in Letchworth State Park today. And I've always wanted to go on a deeper dive of the park and really explore the history of it and dig a little deeper into what's being shown in these photographs. For instance, why are there farms where there's now the Mount Morris Reservoir, right? What happened to this place called Gibsonville? What is this old bridge doing here, right? Why do we see clearings? Why does Lower Falls look so dramatically different, right? All these sorts of interesting questions I had for a long time that this project really let me dive into. Another source of inspiration or motivation for this project is one of my favorite books, the Adirondack Atlas. This was a book published in 2002. This is an expansive encyclopedic look at the Adirondack Park by Jerry Jenkins and Andy Keel. This is now over 20 years old, but I always loved this book. I always wanted to do something like this, apply the same kind of geographic lens to some other topic, and I thought Letchworth State Park, given its rich history, which I'll be covering, would be a really good focus for such a project. And I think the third source, or third kind of background point here for how this project got going is the pandemic. In the early days of the pandemic in the summer of 2020, I spent a lot of time at Letchworth State Park, and that's really where I started to think that this project was realistic. So a lot of times I'd go hike, think of new maps to include in this project, go write this down in the list of possible maps to include in this project. So those are kind of the three sources of inspiration or motivation for this project. Okay, that was my really brief introduction into how this project began. What I now want to do is just spend some time talking about the structure of this atlas. I also want to talk about some of my favorite maps, and then after that we'll get into both the book excerpts as well as the outtakes. The atlas is structured into 4 chapters. The first chapter is an overview of the park, aimed at more of a general audience, maybe the tourist in the park who's unfamiliar with the park, where it is, its size, some of its place names, and so on and so forth. One map that is featured in this first chapter is selected place names and historical or vernacular terms. So I synthesized many different sources with place names, both historical and current, both in English and in indigenous languages as well, to create this map here. And so what I'll be doing throughout this presentation, I'll be showing you the maps. I'll also be trying to zoom in to make them a little more legible. Also, what I should say before I go any further is these maps are designed for print. So sometimes the colors don't really work on the projector here. Sometimes they look a little off. They might look much nicer in print. So this is one of my favorite maps here from the chapter 1. You can see just the variety of different place names. It has some of the more common place names like Great Bend, Lower Falls, Upper Falls, but it has some of the more obscure vernacular terms like Snake Hill, or the Flume, or Cole's Cliff, right? The famous landscape painter Thomas Cole famously painted from Cole's Cliff near Inspiration Point near Middle Falls. In chapter 2, I explore the physical geography, right? The natural topography, its climate, its weather. I dive into its really rich and complex geology as well, right? It's this incredible geological feature, the Letchworth Gorge. So I talk about its bedrock, its sedimentary rock formations, also how glaciers carved the valley and the gorge that we see today. I spend time talking about its land history and ecological communities. Letchworth, even though we think of it as being very green today and natural and rugged, it has a long history of human use and deforestation and mill operations. In the third part of the second chapter, I talk about the weather and climate. And then the fourth section, I talk about the most dominant water feature in the park, which is the Geneseo River and its waterfalls, and as well as the Mount Morris Dam and the Mount Morris Reservoir. I'll be coming back to this map here, but this is one of my favorite maps from this chapter. This is Forest Ecological Communities. You can see a lot of times in this atlas, given the unique linear shape of the park, I had to break it up into 2 different pages to make it fit and to really zoom in here. So in this map, we'll be coming back to it again. We can see just what a patchwork the park is in terms of ecological communities and forest types. Chapter 3 focuses on the human history of the park. One of the reasons I am so passionate and was so interested in Letchworth State Park is it has such a long, complicated human history, going all the way back to Native American indigenous settlement. Fully 1/3 of the park was at one time Native American reservation, up until the 1820s. So it has this remarkable Native American history to it, and we're going to learn that it goes back even farther than just a couple hundred years ago. It also has a rich history of white settlement before the park creation, before the arrival of William P. Letchworth, who purchased the first 1,000 acres of the park. So we have contained within its modern day boundaries former locations of roads, schools, mills, hotels, grocery stores even. The third part of this chapter is devoted to what I'm terming the William P. Letchworth era, the era in which William Pryor Letchworth, the philanthropist and businessman, moved into the modern-day park area, improved it, opened it up to the public, and ultimately donated it to New York State to form the nucleus of the modern-day park. And then the fourth part of this is after park creation, so talking about the expansion of the park, some of the ways in which the park shifted from more passive recreation to active recreation, and some of the infrastructure changes we see in it as well. I'll just zoom in here. I have a map here of schools, mills, and other important buildings in 1852, which captures that amazing history, long history we have contained within the park. It's kind of a unique aspect of this. Not like every park contains entire former village locations and roads and so on. So if I zoom in here, again, this is not quite coming through here on the projector. It's a bit cleaner and more defined there in the books, but we can just see features like the Genesee Valley Canal that ran through the park. And we see roads, houses, even schools clinging to the cliff edges here. Here's SCH abbreviated for school. One of my other favorite maps from this project is land acquisition by year. Letchworth State Park didn't just start as 14,000 acres, right? It started as a humble 1,000 acres, and it was a project that expanded this park over multiple decades. So this map here just portrays that park expansion. Basically anything that's green was a parcel of land that was acquired in the first half of the 20th century. Anything that's kind of that orange color is a parcel of land that was acquired and added to the park in the latter half of the 20th century. So the darker green it goes, the older the parcel is. The darker orange it is, the more recently that parcel was added. And again, we'll come back to this map as well when I read my book excerpts. Also included in this atlas are what I believe to be the oldest set of aerial photos for the park. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is an aerial photo from 1938 of the Lower Falls area in Letchworth State Park. And this does actually capture one of the most, I think, interesting aspects of this aerial photo is that it actually captures the locations of those Civilian Conservation Corps camps. So as I zoom in here, here's CCC Lower Falls Camp number 49, which actually turned into a German prisoner of war camp as well for a time. So another fascinating tidbit about the park's history. And I did speak with people at the parks. I think the aerial photos in this are actually older than the set of aerial photos that the park keeps in their archives. So I managed to find even older photos than the park kept. And then finally, chapter 4 is devoted to tourism, right? And this chapter is broken down further into two different sections. Visitation, so who's visiting the park, where are they coming from, and then also to the activities in the park. So photography, hunting, fishing, bird watching, and so on. I devoted 4 pages of maps to where tourists are from that visit Letchworth State Park. There is no perfect data set that the park keeps as to where all the visitors are originating from. So because of that limitations, I brought in a lot of different data sets and mapped those different data sets in order to portray different angles, different looks at where tourists are originating from. So in this map here, in the top portion of it, we have the entire continental US and portions of Canada. The darker the purple, the more tourists come from that location. In this case, it's county scale. In the bottom portion, given that so many tourists come from the northeast, I just provide a zoom in there where we can see where tourists come from. So not very surprising, we can see Western New York predominates in terms of where tourists come from to visit the park, mainly Erie County, Monroe County, and a lot of the Western New York counties as well. A lot of people associated with Letchworth State Park, both the visitors as well as the managers, like to tout the fact that Letchworth is oftentimes listed as one of America's favorite state parks or best state parks. So I devoted a map to looking at all of these different state park contests and lists to see if there were any other parks that are routinely listed on such lists or make it into such contests. I looked at 3 different lists here. This might be a little challenging to read, but we can see I looked at the USA Today 2015 Reader's Choice Award for Best State Park, I looked at National Geographic's 20 Wild and Beautiful U.S. State Parks list, and then I looked at Thrillist 2021's 30 Best State Parks in America. I gave these 3 different symbols here so we can see which parks are on which list. This is just limited to state parks, and we can see there are only 2 parks in the entire U.S. that are on all 3 lists. One of them is Letchworth State Park, and the other is Hunting Island State Park in South Carolina. So it does turn out that Letchworth State Park is routinely winning these accolades and making these best state park lists. So that was a fun map to look at and to see that Letchworth is really distinctive in this regard. I devoted a map here to where photographs are taken within the park. There is a collection of Flickr photos with geotagged, with coordinates essentially. So I was able to bring this into the software that I used to make these maps, to map all these different points. And then I essentially made this heat map. And this is surprising in how not surprising it is, right? So we can see that the most scenic locations are the most photographed locations within the park. So if I just zoom in here, Lower Falls, Middle Falls, Upper Falls, Great Bend, Wolf Creek area, those tend to be the most photogenic photographed places, according to this data set at least. Okay, at this time I want to read some book excerpts from this atlas. What I'm going to be doing is kind of reconstructing excerpts from this book. I'm not reading from my book chronologically, I'm kind of taking bits from here and there in order to kind of reconstruct this human and environmental history of the park. What I'll also be doing at the same time is showing maps that correspond to the excerpt that I'm reading. And this is where I'm providing some of the history of the park, rather than just advertising my atlas, right? We begin our human and environmental history after the last glacial period, when a continent-sized ice sheet covered most of New York State. As the sheet retreated with a warming climate around 12,000 years ago, the Geneseo River gradually carved a new path, producing the impressive gorge sections seen within the park today as it eroded sedimentary rock, as shown here in map 16. The pre-glacial Geneseo River purportedly flowed through modern-day Nunde and Keshequa Creek Valley, labeled here. For a time, a glacial lake formed from meltwater that covered much of the park area. The Geneseo River in the middle of the park flows through a wider valley that was part of an earlier and more mature course that existed prior to the most recent glaciation. The narrow gorges towards the park's northern and southern ends are sections where the river worked successfully to erode newly encountered bedrock while linking the older pre-existing valley segments. Left behind from the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet was a landscape bare of soil and vegetation. A long process of soil development and ecological succession began. Following glaciation, the region around Letchworth State Park was a tundra-like environment, and then as the climate warmed and more southerly tree species migrated northward, a mixed forest resembling today's eventually developed. The forests of the area have always been in a state of flux during this time, as different plant species migrated northward at varying rates due to differences in seed dispersal strategies, and as individual plant species have responded to climatic changes and other environmental forces. Human history in the park stretches back thousands of years and includes a long yet incomplete record of Native American settlement. Overall, the park is an archaeologically sensitive area, but is not a known hotbed of sites in comparison to the higher density areas just to the northeast outside the park. We can see here with all these tiny gray dots. While no known Paleo-Indian archaeological sites exist in Letchworth State Park itself, evidence places hunter-gatherers and their ancient game species in western New York as early as roughly 11,000 years ago. For example, the Hiscox site, 30 miles north, has yielded numerous artifacts dating to this time, including tools fashioned out of mastodon bones. Knowledge of who occupied the park area and when they occupied it is limited, but available data suggests that Native Americans set up towns and camps nearby around 5,000 years ago. Offering a rough sketch of where activity occurred over the last few millennia is map 50, showing the relative density of archaeological sites, from major towns to unidentified stonework fragments, in and around the park area. The map also shows the locations of notable archaeological sites within the park. The most notable archaeological site investigated within the park boundary predating the Iroquois is at Squae Hill at the park's northern end, shown here. Archaeologists in the 1930s studied earthen burial mounds here dating to as early as 140 AD. Containing graves and artifacts, there were 3 circular mounds 30 feet in diameter and 4 feet high when discovered. Archaeological evidence and sites around the park suggest that residents living in the region around this time, including those that built mounds at Squae Hill, were a sparse population found at the periphery of regional population centers. Available data also suggests that out of any area in the park, Squae Hill was both occupied the longest and most consistently, but still discontinuously, over a span of 1,800 years, whether in the form of towns or camps. A few other towns and camps existed at various points throughout prehistory, both at the valley floor and in the upland areas within the park, and additional burial mounds are located within and near the park, but the cultural affiliation and date of occupation for most sites are uncertain. Other cultural groups inhabited western and central New York, aside from those associated with Squae Hill sites, though few if any sites of those cultures have been definitively identified and described within Letchworth State Park. Map 51 shows Native American town populations in 1790, just before white settlement. The map also shows their approximate overland travel routes here in these dotted lines, one of which was located where River Road on the park's east side is today. If you ever drive River Road on the east side, you're basically tracing a Native American trail. In 1790, nearly 750 persons lived in a 5-town area that included Squae Hill within the park. Here I zoom in, we can see the park boundary here. And these dots here represent Native American towns. The larger the dot, the bigger the population was. Near its southern end was the town of Deowesto or Nunde, with just 48 persons counted, shown here. Note that these population totals are from 1790, just 11 years after American forces destroyed Seneca towns around present-day Geneseo, which are shown here. Population numbers were likely much higher prior to 1779. For example, Geneseo, also known as Little Beardstown, alone had over 100 houses when destroyed. Prior to Euro-American settlement, the land that would become Letchworth State Park was predominantly forest. Around the year 1800, land surveyors described forest conditions in and near the park area as they measured lands into towns and lots that were later sold to settlers. Towards the southern end, forests were a mix of upland tree species composed of pine, oak, chestnut, and hemlock, with beech, maple, hickory, and ironwood in smaller amounts. This map simply portrays the quotes from the surveyors who first traversed the landscape and described the forest conditions in and around the modern-day park area. Towards the northern end, forests contain mainly oak and hickory. Wetlands, along with swales of moister land containing ash and basswood, and steep gullies containing pine and hemlock, occasionally disrupted this pattern. In the bottomland forests along the Geneseo River, forests growing atop rich alluvial soils contained elm, sycamore, butternut, poplar, sugar maple, basswood, ash, and black walnut. The park was located at a transition zone regionally between beech and maple-dominated forests in the cooler, moisture regions west, and oak-dominated forests in the warmer, drier regions east. The landscape in and around the park also contained considerable areas that Native Americans utilized during the 18th century. Native Americans, mainly Iroquois groups, including most importantly the Seneca, located towns along the Geneseo River both within and outside the modern-day park boundary, connecting them by a network of previously mentioned, well-established footpaths and canoe routes. Near towns were large clearings for agriculture, and in the uplands, Native Americans burned forests to remove brush to create an open environment that facilitated travel and hunting. Land surveyors provided evidence of Native Americans' land use. Described were occasional open flats along the Geneseo River, which you can see right here, right in the middle of the former Gardeau Reservation, where Native Americans grew crops. To the northwest and south of the park's eventual location were descriptions of thinly timbered landscapes. that suggest forests with widely spaced trees, thinned from surface burning and absent of brush and undergrowth. One surveyor, just describing an area just off the map here, even noticed a hunting ground burnt over between the park area and Silver Lake to the west. Just north in the current town of Geneseo is an expansive agricultural area along the Genesee River known as the Genesee Flats. Together with other data, these surveyor records suggest that in 1800, the present-day Letchworth State Park was forested, but also a mosaic of ecological communities, and a mixture of both natural and human landscapes. The time from 1790 to 1830 was a transitional period between Native American and white settlement in the park area and surrounding region. Small Native American communities persisted on the Squae Hill and Gardow reservations, whereas the Seneca sold off other reservations nearby, such as Little Beardstown. Some early white settlers lived among the Seneca. A land surveyor observed a community of 6 white families and 5 Native American families farming along the Genesee River on the Gardow Reservation in 1807. Native Americans moved elsewhere, including to other reservations west, and the Seneca sold off portions of the reservations in the park area in the 1820s. About 80 people were living at Squae Hill in 1816. Also living on the Gardow Reservation since 1779 were Mary Jemison and her children, who acquired the reservation lands under the Treaty of Big Tree. The Seneca sold the last of the reservations as part of the first Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1826. The last Seneca left Squae Hill in 1828, not even 200 years ago, and Jemison left Gardow in 1831. The history of Euro-American settlement in the park area begins in the 1790s. Overall, those settlers heavily used the land for timber and farmland through the next 2 centuries. White settlements within the current park area were not extensive, and population in towns comprising the present park area peaked around 1840 before declining until the start of the 20th century. By 1850, the nuclei of white settlement within the park area were the hamlet of Gibsonville, the hamlet of St. Helena, and milling operations around Middle Falls. Just outside the park were the larger clusters of settlement in Mount Morris and Portage, and smaller clusters at Five Corners and River Road Forks. In the mid-19th century, within the modern park boundary were about 160 main buildings, including 12 mills and 5 schools, as estimated from historical maps. Around 1850, St. Helena had numerous mills and stores, a school, and over a dozen dwellings. North-south roads existed along the valley bottom. Although rough terrain and lack of bridges have limited travel between west and east sides of the park historically, in the mid-19th century there were numerous crossings over the Genesee River within the modern-day park boundary, some at bridges and others at low water fords. Compare that with just a single footbridge crossing the entire length of the park today. During the second half of the 19th century, the collective population of the towns surrounding Letchworth, what's now known as Letchworth State Park, steadily declined from around 13,000 in 1850 to 9,000 in 1900. Sawmills had exploited the forests of the area and were closing in the middle of the century, but agriculture persisted. By around 1900, as shown in this map, there were about 140 buildings within the park area, as estimated from historical maps. Still 5 schools, but fewer signs of industry. The number of river crossings shrank. Both the villages of Gibsonville and St. Helena within the park area had seen their peak in the middle of the century. Many pieces of evidence suggest their decline. Decreasing populations, fewer houses, post office closures, damaged mills not rebuilt, damaged buildings and bridges not replaced. Being located at the valley bottom, compounding problems for St. Helena were regular floods on the Genesee River every 5 to 7 years from rains and ice jams that would inundate roads and buildings. Maps 46C and 46D briefly show roads and buildings within the present-day park area in 1900 and 2020, respectively, showing changes in the era of park creation and expansion and the emergence of park infrastructure that we know today. Here we see circa 1950, we can see the dots for buildings, the lines for roads. And by 2020, we see a lot of those roads and buildings removed out of the bottomland of the gorge there. We now move on to the William Pryor Letchworth era. The park owes its existence almost solely to William Pryor Letchworth, whose estate formed the original 1,000 acres of the park in 1906. Born in 1823 in Brownville, New York, near Watertown, and growing up near Auburn, New York, Mr. Letchworth was a businessman and philanthropist who made his fortune with Pratt & Letchworth in Buffalo, manufacturing hardware for horses, saddles, carriages, and trains. In 1857, he sought to purchase a country estate when, at the suggestion of a friend, he took the train to the Portage Wooden Bridge to view the waterfalls on the Genesee River while returning to Buffalo from New York City. Here he found the ideal spot, a location replete with natural beauty but also abused by industry. In 1875, he recalled his first glance at the land that would become his Glen Iris estate. He said, quote, "There were unsightly objects in the form of ruinous buildings, wrecks of abandoned enterprises, and bare points that had been stripped of their foliage. In every direction, the eye encountered something that shocked the aesthetic sense. But I saw that nature was endeavoring to recover herself," end quote. One of my favorite facts I've discovered from this project is that before his fateful trip to Portage, William Pryor Letchworth had considered situating his estate on the shores of Lake Ontario or the Niagara River. So if he had located his property on one of those shorelines, Letchworth State Park might have been located in a very different location than it is today, right? Somewhere on Lake Ontario or the Niagara River. Map 59 shows the order of Mr. Letchworth's land purchases to create his estate. In this map, essentially the closer the dots are together, the older that parcel of land is, or the longer ago that William Pryor Letchworth had acquired that parcel to form his estate. This also has some modern day landmarks as well for reference. He purchased his first parcel of land around Middle Falls in 1858. But it took until 1898 for him to acquire the final parcel of land, a span of about 40 years. At the time, his land holdings were not adjacent, but he eventually pieced together one continuous property on both sides of the gorge. From above Upper Falls to below Lower Falls, and lands from Lower Falls to the river at Great Bend. As shown in map 60, Mr. Letchworth commissioned various improvements, many of which can be seen in map 60 and many of which still exist. These include additions to his home residence, now known as the Glen Iris Inn, stonework, water features, landscaping, and planting trees. Noted landscape architect William Webster, a student of Frederick Law Olmsted, designed much of William Pryor Letchworth's estate. Mr. Letchworth owned and ran farms on his property as well, near where the Visitors Center is located today. In this map here, we can see Prospect Home Farm, Chestnut Lawn Farm, and Waterbrunn Farm. The modern day Visitor Center is basically right here. So you can see those farms surrounded what is now known as the Visitor Center area. Mr. Letchworth was notable for allowing visitors onto his estate, such as my great-great-great-uncle, whose photos I showed you. He even made improvements to make viewing the gorge scenery easier. He believed that allowing people to connect with nature on his property could help cure some of the ills of society. As opposed to map 60, map 25 estimates the minimum age of forest within the original Glen Iris estate area by showing which patches of current forests were also forested in 1880 or 1950, as determined from historical maps and aerial photos. Essentially, the darker the green is here, the older the forest parcel is. While the mature forests of the park typically started growing around 1890 after an era of deforestation, tree ring samples from fallen trees have provided evidence of ancient trees in the oldest forests in this map. According to park naturalist Doug Bassett, one white oak near the Genesee Arch Bridge was 375 years old, and an eastern red cedar tree near Inspiration Point was 435 years old. Doug Bassett and I also believe we just found an oak that's about 450 years old, which might be the oldest oak in the entire state, near Middle Falls on former Letchworth original estate property. Since Mr. Letchworth's 1,000-acre donation to the state, the park has continually expanded. Land acquisition especially occurred in the 1920s to 1960s, but the state added a parcel to the park as recently as 2003. Map 61 shows the years in which the state purchased parcels. Although exceptions exist, the state generally acquired the west side and portions of the east side, the majority of the park, from the 1920s to 1940s, and acquired much of the east side in the 1950s and 1960s. Mr. Letchworth remains the largest grantor of lands to the park. The names of former owners are sometimes associated with roads and park landmarks, such as Kissel Point and Eddie's Overlook. Visitors today might not realize that the federal government owns 3,500 acres of the valley bottom and northern end for dam operation and flood management, though it leases most of those lands to the state of New York as part of a 99-year lease. Back to this map here. As mentioned, the darker the green is, the older it is within the first half of the 20th century, and then the darker the orange is, the newer it is in the second half of the 20th century. So it highlights those older parcels in green, especially those in darker green, and then the newly acquired parcels in orange, and especially the darker orange. Visitors to Letchworth State Park today note the overall forested character of the park, but the forested character of the park really emerged only after the 20th century park expansion via those land acquisitions and subsequent reforestation. Map 24 shows areas that have reforested since 1940 versus those areas that were forested in 1940. In 1940, roughly half of the present day park area was forested, shown here in green. The portions shown in yellow are those areas that were reforested after 1940. Today that number, that 40 or half, a 50% figure has increased to about 70% forest. However, this number excludes the forested, flooded bottomland of the Mount Morris Reservoir that contains patches of younger floodplain forest, sometimes classified as shrubland. Older forests are likely those that reforested in the 19th century after clear cutting, former woodlots that their owners selectively logged, or untouched primary forests in inaccessible locations like remote river terraces and steep ravines. Even more than before, modern-day Letchworth State Park is a patchwork of land cover types and forests of varying ages that has resulted from both the variability of environmental conditions and its history of land use. Two general land covers dominate Letchworth State Park at present. Forests cover the valley slopes and uplands, whereas shrublands and other areas routinely flooded by the Mount Morris Reservoir are found throughout the valley bottom of the northern two-thirds of the park. As shown in map 26, the most common types are older oak, hickory, and hemlock northern hardwood forests and younger northern hardwood forests. Conifer evergreen plantations and older maple basswood forests also make up sizable portions of total forest cover, whereas floodplain forests found along the Geneseo River are less common. Cliffside plant communities and wetlands are examples of minor but important parts of the park's natural environment. So today, just how important is Letchworth State Park as a habitat and refuge for plant and animal species? And how does Letchworth State Park fit within the larger regional picture of land conservation? Compared to other state parks in New York, but excluding the Adirondack and Catskill Forest Preserves, the park is one of the most important for protecting species of concern in the state. As shown in map 28, the park ranks highly among state parks according to a 2004 report. It ranks first in documented rare plants, tied for second in documented imperiled animals, first in documented listed species combined, both plants and animals, and tied for 11th in documented significant natural communities. None of those species of concern are federally listed endangered species, but the park can still contain undiscovered rare species. Also, as shown in map 30, the park is one of the few large tracts of protected lands in western New York, where it is only smaller than Allegheny State Park and the Finger Lakes National Forest. Overall, Letchworth State Park is a valuable refuge for species and natural communities, and reversion to more natural land cover via reforestation is an emerging ecological success story. However, life within the park faces threats such as invasive species that outcompete natives and the growing threat of climate change, both of which could alter the composition, structure, and function of the park ecosystem. That concludes some of my book excerpts. What I'd like to finish off with is just as kind of a fun aspect and kind of another way to peek into this process of this project. I'd like to just go over some of the Atlas outtakes. For every 3 maps that made it in the book, there was 1 map that didn't. And there were a whole lot of reasons why I had to cut maps. I cut maps that I viewed as being redundant. Some maps that I think were too specialized, I actually made a map of tree height. I'm a forest ecologist, biogeographer by nature. I think it was just a little too specialized and it was a little hard to work into the narrative of the park history that I was trying to write. Some maps were just plain too weird. One of the first maps I made was actually flight paths over Letchworth, but it was a kind of a strange map and I didn't really have a good place to put it. But here it is anyways. So the thicker the line, the more flights there are that follow that path. If I zoom in here, you can probably see some of these a little more better. One of my favorite paths is the Paris to Houston flight. So if you're ever at the Hogs Back overlook and you look and you see a very high flying plane going southwest to northeast, it's probably the Paris to Houston flight there. I was also surprised to find that certain data sets, which I thought would obviously exist, didn't actually exist. The park doesn't maintain any sort of entrance point statistics. They count the number of cars that enter, but they don't count the number of people, and they have some back of the envelope math to determine how many people go into the park as a whole, but they don't actually measure entrance by entrance where people are accessing the park. I thought I was going to have this really exciting map of Letchworth-related place names. I assumed the Letchworth State Park, being this huge 14,000-acre parcel, would spin off all these place names with Letchworth. There were only a handful of place names with Letchworth in it, so I cut some maps that I just thought were too boring. There's not a lot of Letchworth place names. There's a Letchworth school. There's a couple of businesses that have Letchworth or like Middle Falls in the place name, but it wasn't a very exciting map. I also cut a lot of material that I thought was too dark. There are accidents at the park. Tragically, there are deaths at the park. There are accidents, falls. I did obtain data on 911 calls and deaths. I ultimately, partially at the request of the park, also I cut it. And I think I wanted to highlight some of the more positive aspects, if you will, of the park. But still, here are the 911 calls if anyone's interested. So you can see this next slide here, this is sort of a heat map, so kind of the hotter temperature colors in the map represent more of that type of 911 calls. So for instance, disorderly conduct, there's a hot spot sitting right over the campground, if you're familiar with Letchworth State Park. I think people are drinking one too many and disturbing the peace, we'll say. Falls and traumatic injuries, these are 911 calls. You can see they cluster around those areas with the impressive gorges and cliffs and scenery where people congregate as well. I wanted to create a map that paid homage to the employees that keep the park running. There's a few dozen staff, part-time and full-time. I spoke with the state, I spoke with the park. I wanted to create a map just of where people are commuting from to get to the park to work. I think they thought it was a phishing attempt, that I was trying to somehow obtain confidential information. So I was not able to even obtain employee hometown, even just their zip codes, which I'm a little frustrated about. I had a nice couple sets of maps planned and just couldn't do them. This is a thematic map atlas, meaning it's focused on these themes. It's focused on telling the story of Letchworth State Park. It's not a reference map atlas, so I didn't devote a lot of pages to providing simply reference maps, how to get from point A to point B within the park. I also cut an entire chapter on nearby communities. I wanted to map demographic characteristics, age, race, sex, income. I ended up cutting that chapter because we're in rural upstate New York. The communities looked similar, so the maps were very homogeneous and not really interesting to look at. The communities around Letchworth State Park, they're small, they're rural, they're aging, they're white, and there's really no variability in the map, right? And we saw this pattern over and over and over again, and I just decided to cut it. Really the only unique communities are, I would say, Geneseo being a college town, Groveland having a prison population, also had a unique population as well. But after that, it was kind of repetitive, and I was kind of telling the same story over and over and over again with these maps. So I ended up just cutting that partially because of space limitations as well. So that concludes my talk. Thanks once again for being here. I'm happy to answer any questions. We have maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do so. If you have any questions about the book, the SUNY Press link is up there. If you have a smart device, you can also just hold your camera up to that QR code and it'll open up the link for you as well. But thank you once again, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
We don't have to take a test, do we?
I don't yet have a course on Letchworth State Park. Maybe one day at Geneseo I will. Yes?
My father used to talk about the WPA, and they had some significance. From what he told me, they did work around there that people are still enjoying today.
So the CCC is the organization, that had, I would say
So
after William Pryor Letchworth, are most responsible for the character and the historical value of the park. There were 5 camps, and each camp had about 200 young men working at it. They were responsible for making the overlooks, a lot of the stone walls, the trails, the cabins, and really, it's becoming more well marked too, that aspect of the park's history. In the last couple of years, there's a lot more signage directing visitors to where those CCC sites are. I didn't show it here, but in the book there is a map showing all the locations of the CCC projects in their camps as well. They planted trees as well. There's a lot of conifer plantations that were planted by the CCC as well.
What about windmills? Are they allowed?
Within the park?
Yeah.
I don't believe so. I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of solar development happening around the park.
Okay.
I don't think it's within the view shed. Like, I don't think you can yet see windmills from the park, but certainly if you're driving to the park from just about any direction, you're going to run into some wind farms, yeah.
I thought that was interesting about the Germans, prisoners they were in the CC camps.
Yes. Yeah, so the Lower Falls camp,
How many were there? A lot of them, or?
I don't know the exact number. I mean, it was only open for a few years. It was at the very end of the war, and it closed very quickly. But a lot of those CCC camps, I mean, there's only 5. A lot of them were repurposed. I think one of them turned into, obviously one turned into the prisoner of war camp. I think one turned into a canning facility for a time, or at least a residence for people that were working in canning. Yep. But then they were quickly torn down, which is why that set of 1938 photos is really remarkable, because those camps only existed for about 10 years, and so to have aerial photos in that narrow window was really fortunate for this project. Any questions?
Yeah, when the glacier came over, it kind of ended at like Portageville, supposedly, and where it pushed up the ground, is that what they call a moraine?
Yeah, that's the Valley Heads Moraine.
Okay.
So moraine is a term to describe any sort of ground up material by a glacier. The ones at the very end of the glacier are terminal moraines.
Okay.
And they're really interesting places. I spoke to a geologist, retired geologist at Geneseo, and there's all sorts of interesting things that the glacier churns up that's found at the moraine, like fossils, fossilized wood.
Yeah.
It's kind of all mixed together and preserved in those areas. In that map, it would be too many slides to flip back, but I do symbolize the moraine, and you can. I think I labeled the Valley Heads Moraine there, right at the end of it. Yep.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Was there very many Indian villages around or in Letchworth?
Gardeau was a location that the village was found right in the middle of what became the Gardeau Reservation. It was never heavily populated. I had that figure in 1807. It was a mixed community of both Native American and white. There was only about 11 families total. Really fascinating history. I think when Mary Jemison first took refuge there, she found runaway slaves that were hiding, which was really another fascinating aspect of the history. So, yeah, I was talking to, I might have been in the first row here, when I was executing this project, I thought I'd be sick of the park by the end of it, but I wasn't. There was just so much to learn about the park and all these fascinating anecdotes about this.
I read her book, it was so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The Genesee River, in that part of the park, was it ever used for any kind of commercial use?
The state dredged it from kind of the middle of the park all the way through like Geneseo and down to York. So it was used at least for a time, but the Genesee River has challenges, especially when, in the 19th century it was either flooded or shallow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it flooded every 5 to 7 years, and with deforestation, when you remove forest cover, you create a river that's more temperamental, right? Because the forest buffers against flooding and it stabilizes the flow. So I think the river there always had challenges.
Couldn't depend on it.
Yeah, you couldn't really depend on it. Certain times a year, with the logging industry, they were cutting the wood, sawing it, floating it down. And then, as I mentioned, they dredged parts of it as well to try to get barges in there. Okay, any other questions?
Where did Mary Jemison, where did she live?
She lived at Gardeau. I have a map in there. Because I have a map of all the places that Letchworth and Jemison lived, and it's a little flow line map. Mary Jemison was everywhere. She started off in southeastern Pennsylvania. That's where she was kidnapped. She was moved down to southern Ohio. She married. She moved up to the Genesee Valley. With the Sullivan campaign, when they destroyed all the villages, she fled to Gardeau, and that's where she remained a long time. Yeah, it's a really fascinating story. It was a fun project to kind of piece together all the places she lived.
Just to add to that, the Gardeau Reservation wasn't really a planned reservation. During the treaty negotiation, she basically injected herself into it and got herself her own reservation around where she was living. So it was basically 9 reservations, and Mary Jemison wants one, here you go. So,
and I think she kind of tricked the negotiators.
She did.
She said, I just want from this creek to that creek, and it ended up being like 18,000 acres.
Yeah.
She was the biggest landowner in Western New York for a time, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
They didn't realize how much she was really asking for.
Yep.
So at that point, they just wanted to get it over with. So.
Yeah, so that was another fascinating aspect. I didn't realize before this project how much of Letchworth State Park was at one time reservation and how recently it was reservation too, into the 1820s. It's not even 200 years that large tracts of the park have been out of reservation. Okay, well, thank you once again. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Stephen, again for that very insightful presentation. Just a quick PSA for some upcoming events. Our next guest speaker will be Derek Maxfield on September 7th. He'll be talking about Victorian deathways in antebellum era United States, so how they dealt with death and mourning and all of that stuff to go along with our cemetery exhibit. Then September 14th is our next trivia. It's on the Mayflower. So anybody with those ancestors going all the way back to the Pilgrims, definitely check it out. Then we have another guest speaker on the 21st, Joseph Van Remmen, who will tell us how Buffalo got its name. and it might not be what you expect. So, and then the next Java with Joe will be the 28th, and it'll be Bernita Scoynes and Charlie Boyd on John C. Gardner, our famous author from Batavia. So be sure to check everything out. Everything's on our website, Facebook. You can call me if you're a member. You get the email. So be sure to check everything out.
Don't forget the tea and spirits.
Oh yes, sorry. The last Tea and Spirits, September 17th. It's a Sunday at 2 o'clock. You can come and have a nice Victorian tea with General Martindale, John Yates, and Albert Brisbane.
Before he arrived.
Good. You remember very good.
I've said it enough times at this point, I better remember, so.
Stay after the